The real culprit in this whole thing is the U.S. Federal Reserve Board, the Fed.
How come?
Early in, after the collapse of the high technology stocks, by the way, in 1998, the Fed had bailed the U.S. economy out when a major hedge fund went under. And so it really lowered interest rates, pumped in the credit. And what the U.S. has been doing, at least what the Fed's been doing, is preventing recessions from taking place. Now, nobody likes recessions, okay? But recessions do a job. And the job is they get rid of past mistakes, they get them written off, and they get the associated debts off the balance sheet and your balance sheet cleaned up. And then you can undergo a new expansion. Okay, what the Fed has been doing since 1998 is stopping recessions from taking place. And therefore, those bad debts never get written off, and they've been accumulating and accumulating and accumulating. So they've grown and grown and grown. And as we got into the 2000s, the Fed began to realize that they were being overwhelmed by debt. So what they did is underwent a kind of a sea change, a plan by which they would encourage asset growth. That is to say, the value of common stocks going up, but the value of real estate. And so they encouraged that by free and easy credit. And, of course, then up went the value of the real estate. There were the loans. Everything looked pretty good. Well, the problem is, Steve, everything works fine until the price of real estate goes down. Then,
and it's a house of cards.
Then the loan remains and the asset value doesn't. Greenspan, he took a look at what Bill Clinton did when he was the president, and what Clinton had done is he'd done a tremendous job of turning around a really, really poor U.S. government balance sheet and had strengthened it and strengthened to the point by 2000 that people were afraid that 20 and 30-year bonds were going to disappear. In fact, government debt was going to disappear. That's prime AAA quality kind of debt. And Greenspan looked at that and he said, whoa, you know something, so that's fine. What if you got, and in his book he names somebody like Nixon or Lyndon B. Johnson, presidents that he did not trust. What if you got them in charge and they had this wonderful balance sheet, they could do anything they wanted, including wage war on countries, which they treated as enemies or whatever. What if that would happen? It would be probably a really good thing if he got to George Bush, who, pardon me for saying so, is a little thick, and convinced him to follow in the ways of Ronald Reagan. That is to say, cut taxes, do government deficit financing, and so on. So he really, really caused the U.S. balance sheet to plunge. Well, George Bush liked this because you get very popular when you spend money and cut taxes. So Bush was kind of in cahoots with Greenspan, but this wasn't Bush's idea in the slightest. This really was Alan Greenspan. As I say, it's all laid out in his book.
And I thought cutting debt was a good idea, but apparently not.
Not according to Alan Greenspan. Not if you're going to allow some megalomaniac president to get his hands on the levers. So that's what happened.
Here's what billionaire investor George Soros had to say about the crisis of consumer confidence that's going on right now. He said, the current crisis is not only the bust that follows the housing boom, it is basically the end of a 60-year period of continuing credit expansion based on the dollar as a reserve currency. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And if I can put this into perspective, at the risk of throwing some numbers to your audience, and these are some big numbers. From 1920 to 1980, for every dollar of GDP that was generated, about $1.40 of debt was generated, and that's what we would call a natural relationship. Okay, today, and this is really since 2000, that number has changed to about $3.50 per every dollar of GDP. And what that has meant, then, we've got this enormous accumulation of debt. Now, the size of it, the excess size of it over what it would have been, is $26 trillion. Well, global GDP is only 80 trillion. So you can start to see that the size of this excess debt on the U.S. balance sheet is just absolutely massive. Now, here's George Soros's point, I think, and that is to say that if you go and you attack, if you bring down the indebtedness of the states back down to where it was,
it's more natural relationship.
It's more natural relationship. something has to disappear on the other side. And if you've got $26 trillion of debt, you've got $26 trillion of assets. So those assets are owned basically by foreigners. So what you do is you deflate the U.S. debt and you deflate the U.S. foreigners' assets. Well, no matter how you slice it, that is not good.
Not good because?
Not good because if you get $26 trillion of assets disappearing, and by the way, how many of them have to be written off? Because if you make a bad loan, okay, and then I default on it, all of a sudden you don't have an asset at all. I'd at least have had the pleasure of spending the money. You have just loaned it to me and have watched it disappear.
I'm out of pocket now.
And you're out of pocket, yes.
Well, we've obviously been watching the I was going to say the dramatic fall, but actually the fall and then the rise and then the fall in the stock market over the last few days has been really quite spectacular in what's happening. Is this finally a financial markets reaction to all of which you have been talking about?
Yes. The problem really began to appear about last August, I think, when it first hit. But it's now finally getting into the stock market, and it's beginning to cause the stock market to be extremely jittery. Whenever you see the stock market, by the way, beginning to bounce up and down with the kind of height and depth that it's going to, unfortunately, Steve, the last time that I remember the market being this volatile was September, October in 1987. And that, of course, led to a catastrophic decline.
Mark Faber is a highly influential economic forecaster and investment advisor who warned that the October 1987 crash was on the way, then predicted the Asian financial crisis a decade later. Mark Faber has raised the spectre of depression. What is your worst-case scenario?
The worst-case scenario is that, and I would not rule out this to be the case, essentially the last 20 years if we have this expansion of the financial sector and we have accelerating debt growth. The US has a large trade and current account deficit that throws at the present time roughly $800 billion into the world, and that this has created what we call the global excess liquidity. Let's say the US consumer retrenches badly, the trade and current account deficit shrink, then international liquidity will shrink, and that is very bad for all asset markets, not just for stocks. It will also be bad for commodities. Once commodity prices would decline, it would obviously lead to some problems in the commodity producers of the world, and also if the US consumer retrenches, potentially it can lead to a slowdown in production overseas in China. If combined with a slowdown in China, oil prices decline, it leads to a depression in the Middle East and in oil-producing regions. And after the global boom we had, 2001 to 2007, during which essentially every country was growing except for Zimbabwe, and that this global synchronized boom, which is unique in the history of capitalism, never happened before, that every country is growing rapidly, that this global boom is followed by a colossal global bust. That is the worst case scenario.
I do hope we're well short of that. Mark Faber, thanks very much for talking with us.
My pleasure.
This year, over 1 million Americans will lose their home after being sold junk mortgages they could never repay. But America's multi-billion-dollar consumer debt crisis is only the tip of the iceberg. America owes the rest of the world nearly $3 trillion. If it defaults on its debts, then more than just a few small banks would collapse. The world economy is in danger. This is going to affect your job, your savings, your mortgage, and your pension. I'm Tony Norfield. Until I left the city last year, I was a global head of research at one of Europe's leading banks. After 20 years of analysing financial markets, I'm convinced that today the world economy is in serious trouble. It's been common knowledge for some time that America has been living beyond its means. Its enormous debts have threatened the world economy before. 10 years ago, the US Federal Reserve had to rescue a collapsing system by pouring cash to the money markets. But today, the money markets fear that the combined resources of the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank will not be sufficient to bail the system out. The days of easy money and easy profit are over.
Mr. President, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming.